Share screen here. And can you see the slideshow?
Not yet.
Okay.
Sometimes it's tricky. You have to press that one little share button at the bottom after clicking the appropriate screen.
Ah, yes. Thank you.
Yep. There we go. And just put it in presentation mode and we're good to go.
Great. Okay. All right. I will be going quickly. I probably put too many slides in here, but my name is Bob Schelly, and I'll be talking about some of the projects in our newly rebranded Native Fish Ecology and Conservation Program at Grand Canyon. And a quick acknowledgement of the many agencies and nonprofits and universities that help us with both funding and collaboration. And I'll jump right into a review of the 8 native species in the Colorado River Basin. So at one time, pre-dam, all of these species were in Grand Canyon. As many people know, the 4 big river fishes, 4 of them are endangered, and those include the big predator, Colorado pike minnow, bony tail, humpback chub, and razorback sucker. And I'll talk about possible downlisting of 2 of those in a moment. But first, we'll discuss how 3 of those species are extirpated from Grand Canyon. That means they're not extinct, but they're no longer found in Grand Canyon proper. And a final side note is that in the last year or so, there was an expert panel that looked at the possibility, discussed the possibility, and is putting out a white paper soon on a possible experimental reintroduction of pike minnow, which would be very exciting. Just to briefly touch on the potential for downlisting. So this is a positive thing. Conditions basin-wide have improved for both humpback chub and razorback sucker. And this has led to proposals for downlisting to threatened. And those are at different stages. This is release for chub and for razorback sucker. I'll just briefly say that they're at different stages. Humpback chub are further along in the process. About a year ago, that was open for public review. So if chub are downlisted, that will happen first. Don't know what will happen with razorbacks. Let's talk about why native fishes have become imperiled in the Colorado River Basin. There's really 2 big reasons, and some are habitat and physical related to dams and changes to the flow regime, and then invasive species are another issue. But to talk about the physical aspects first, so as everyone knows, pre-dam, what dams have done really have removed the highs and lows of the normal flow regime. And the figure at the top left shows flows. So in the pre-dam Colorado River was subject to really high magnitude spring floods and pretty low late summer base flows. And the dam has cut the tops and bottoms off of those. So you now have a colder, more clear, more steady state flow, but that fluctuates more over a daily basis with hydropeaking, where releases are increased to serve power demands on a daily basis. So that's a dramatic change in the flow regime. And in terms of temperature, you look at the bottom graph, the pre-dam river, of course, during summer season each year was warm enough that it was suitable. This is just humpback chub. So exceeded the minimum for growth and reproduction, minimum temperature. And in the years post-dam, often for many years in a row, those conditions weren't met. So you see some of the physical limitations to native fishes, and then invasive species, which compete with and prey on native fishes. And those introductions to the basin started in the late 19th century with catfish and carp, which were brought out by train and released into the river. And then even Grand Canyon introduced trout into tribs in the 20s. More recently, the only introductions have been at Lee's Ferry, where Arizona Game and Fish has introduced sterile rainbows. But let me just touch on some of the future potential threats, and these are a huge problem in the upper basin. These are very high-risk invasive predators. And going forward, as Grand Canyon, as the water gets warmer, as Lake Powell levels get lower, one of the biggest threats here is that smallmouth bass will be established. They've had a huge impact on native fishes in the upper basin. Many of these, bass, walleye, green sunfish, they survive passage through Glen Canyon Dam. We catch them incidentally in Grand Canyon. The hope is that these don't become established. And right now, paradoxically, the dam and the Pierce Ferry Rapid are providing some measure of protection against establishment of those species. But to hit upon the theme toward a brighter future, the fact is that Grand Canyon, uniquely within the basin, is a stronghold for native fishes. And so in Western Grand Canyon, when you sample, more than 95% of your catch are native fishes, and that is unique within the basin. Grand Canyon is home to the largest remaining humpback chub population in the world and has abundant native suckers. So let me touch on three of our projects, the Park Service Fisheries Program, related to conservation of native fishes in the canyon. The three that I'll touch on are tributary translocations of chub, razorback sucker surveys, and then non-native removal centered on Bright Angel Creek. So chub translocations. This is just a review of the disjunct distribution of humpback chub. They're a canyon-bound species, and there were multiple upper basin populations. All of those are small but stable, save for a dinosaur, wherein the Yampa humpback chub have been extirpated, thanks probably to lots of pike and smallmouth bass. But Grand Canyon has the largest by far population of chub, and that is centered on the Little Colorado River. And the reason for our translocation program is quite simply to provide redundancy for that Little Colorado River population in case of some catastrophic event that would threaten the LCR. And so based on studies, Valdez et al. 2000, some of the best candidate tributaries were identified that would provide habitat suitable for humpback chub, warmer tributary habitat where they could satisfy their life history requirements. And those are Havasu, Shinnemoo, and Bright Angel Creeks came out on top. And the Park Service has since 2009 translocated to all of those creeks so those are captures of larval chub from the Little Colorado River to these creeks. I'll note that there are chub established in Havasu. There are some chub in Bright Angel. It's been the most recent to receive translocations. In Shinnemoo, since the Galahad fire there in 2014, there are no chub above the Barrier Falls in Shinnemoo. Translocation involves baseline surveys of the recipient creek, just to know what threats are there, what the status of native fishes are, and then collection of larval fish, which has minimal impact on the population in the Little Colorado River. Those fish are taken, say, to Dexter, it's now Snark, to a fish hatchery in New Mexico. They're grown for a year. They're implanted with pit tags, and then they're flown into the recipient creek for the translocation. Those populations are then monitored twice a year, in addition to hoop netting in the main stem. So there's netting both in the tributary and in the main stem. And that's collaborative, multiple agencies. And then as needed, non-native removal takes place. I'll just quickly touch on the fact that these translocated populations don't exist in isolation. So these simple graphs just show movement, recaptures of tagged, translocated fish outside of, in this case, Shinnemoo. You see there's some exchange some of these fish return to the Little Colorado River, some move downstream, and at Havasu, also exchange up and downstream, covering those great distances. So these translocations, in addition to establishing populations in the creeks, bolster main stem aggregations, and you get some genetic exchange canyon-wide. Let's talk about razorback sucker surveys. So until about 10 years ago, it was known that there was a small and self-sustaining population of razorbacks in Lake Mead, but it was kind of a surprise to find some adults in Grand Canyon. And this led to a monitoring project that's gone on annually for some years now, looking at spawning and habitat use in Grand Canyon by razorbacks. And it involves implantation of sonic and radio tags to conduct telemetry on adults. There have been a few releases of adults to follow them around, see where they're going and where they might be spawning. There's a network up on top, that SUR, that tube, these submersible receivers that listen for those sonic tags. And then there's monthly summertime seining to collect larval and small-bodied fishes. And the result of these surveys has shown that razorbacks are spawning in Grand Canyon. So larval razorbacks have been collected fairly widely, haven't yet seen any juveniles. This may be because the river is so cold, but this monitoring has also shown just how well native fishes are doing in Western Grand Canyon. Just to touch on the trends over the course of this project, and in red in the center on the left, you see larval razorback captures. Those have declined, as well as the pop estimate for razorbacks in Lake Mead over the period of this study. And that may be because, or at least partly because of Pierce Ferry Rapid interrupting the spawning migrations of razorbacks into the canyon. So we're in the early stages right now of organizing an expert panel to look at this. And one result that will be considered may be augmentation. So capture of wild small razorbacks, growth and in a hatchery, and then release in Grand Canyon, not unlike chub translocation. Moving on to non-native removal. And our project is centered on Bright Angel Creek and targets brown trout. This is a pretty big project that's gone on since 2012 in the winter months and involves backpack electrofishing removals of trout across the full 13 miles of Bright Angel Creek and the operation of a fish weir at the confluence to prevent trout from running upstream. And I'll note that fish removed in this project to address tribal concerns related to taking of life, they're preserved either for human consumption or to feed to ceremonial eagles at aviaries, like at Zuni. The reason that this project began, this non-native suppression project, was that by the early 2000s, Bright Angel Creek had become ground zero of brown trout production in Grand Canyon. That figure shows main stem captures, and the red arrow shows the river mile of Bright Angel. And so this problematic invasive, that they get very large and they eat a lot of native fishes. Bright Angel was the main source. So that led to this project of backpack electrofishing and the weir, which from 2012 to 2019 resulted in more than 95% reduction in the brown trout in Bright Angel, with impacts felt in reduced brown trout catches in the main stem and surrounding reaches. This last year, we did have a resurgence, an uptick that was driven just by a really large young of year class. And I think this is partly because of dry conditions, no early spring flood pulses. So a really favorable year for survival of young trout. And it just underscores that mechanical removal is probably insufficient to eliminate trout, and there will be flare-ups. And so it requires some level of continued suppression. To address that and reduce that, though, one thing we're considering is renovation, which means use of rotenone, which is a fish toxicant, above barriers in upper Bright Angel, which would eliminate trout over about 4 miles of stream. They wouldn't be able to recolonize from below, and it would reduce the number of stream miles where suppression, mechanical removal is necessary each year. Final topic will be brown trout, an uptick in brown trout at Lee's Ferry that has taken place over the last, well, since about 2014, coincident with this period where our suppression efforts have led to big declines in the vicinity of Bright Angel. So you see the green down arrow at Bright Angel, and around this time, the uptick at Lee's Ferry. And that lower right figure just shows different size classes of browns and their increase at Lee's Ferry, where they had been a small incidental part of the catch. So this is concerning because not just to the impacts to the rainbow trout fishery at Lee's Ferry, but the fear that you'll get really big year classes and emigration from this new source population that will impact native fishes and humpback chub at the LCR, native fishes throughout the canyon. So a recent modeling project to look at causation of and looking mainly at the immigration events that started around 2014 was a multi-state mark recapture modeling project that we did with Charles Yakulik at GCMRC. And we just broke up the whole canyon into 5-mile blocks and with seasonal time steps, 4 seasons, and looked at 20 years of pit tag recapture data of brown trout. And without going at length into the model, the take-home result of this modeling effort, which looked at different covariates for drivers of movement, it supported years with fall high flow experiments, November high flow experiments, being years where you see increased brown trout immigration into Lee's Ferry. And it's a result that is not terribly surprising, given that brown trout in their native range in Europe have evolved to queue off of fall flood events for their spawning movements. So this is just one little piece of the life history of brown trout that may be useful going forward as we look at ways to manage this species. I'll note that there's an incentivized harvest right now at Lee's Ferry, and if you're interested, you can get $25 a head for angling and turning in brown trout at Lee's Ferry. So I rushed through that. With that, I'm now able to take questions.
Bob, thank you so much. We do have 1 minute for questions. So if anyone would like to come off mute or put it in the chat, let's ask Bob a question.
Emily, there is one in the chat.
Great. I see it from Jan. Would the proposed dams along the Little Colorado River have an effect on the humpback chub?
They would be catastrophic, yes. It would be terrible for that population. So hopefully those are dead in the water.
On that uplifting note,
Bob,
you heard it here.
Have you been consulted, or has anyone spoken with anyone regarding that in terms of the dams?
Yeah, people even at higher levels, region and higher, are well aware, and the Park Service had got together experts and commented on that. So yes, at higher levels, that possibility is being followed, and the Park Service's voice is being passed along.
We have 2 quick questions. Do you have to turn in the trout to get the bounties at Lee, and where do the browns at Lee's spawn?
So yes, you have to, there's a freezer, I think it's at the Interp Center at Navajo Bridge, and you do have to turn in the heads, and then they're spawning. What 4 Mile Bar in particular is a spawning site. There is also known spawning up around the slough at minus 11 mile. There may be other sites. Those are two I know of specifically.
Bob, Dr. Schelly, thank you so much. Really appreciate your offering today, your presentation. If you have questions, you might stick around. You can ask them directly in the chat, but I will remove that